Welcome, dear listener, to Pillow Tales. Tonight, we are journeying into a place of profound quietude, where the only sound is the gentle whisper of the narrative, designed to cradle you into deep, restorative sleep. Before we begin, settle yourself now, perhaps taking a slow, calming breath, and exhale any lingering thought or tension from your day. Feel the warmth of the linen, the soft give of your mattress, and the comforting darkness of your room. It is here, in this sanctuary, that we find a tiny, cozy space in an old London club, where the greatest mind in detective history is attempting, and perhaps failing, to rest. Tonight, our journey takes us to the 1930s, to a world of exquisite manners, mahogany panels, and tiny telling imperfections. It is a world viewed through the keen, meticulous eyes of the great Hercule Poirot, whose little grey cells, even when settling down for the night, are often compelled by the irresistible need for order and truth. Now, as the soft, ethereal beauty of the night unfurls around you, imagine the calming glow of the aurora curtains above, the distant twinkle of firefly stars. Allow the gentle rhythm of the story to guide your mind away from the noise of the day, and tell me, quietly, in your mind, what time is it where you are right now? And what city is preparing to dream? Think of that quiet location and let its peace settle over you. Now close your eyes, relax your jaw, and let us begin. The little grey cells go to sleep. A Poirot bedtime mystery. Chapter 1. The Sanctuary of Routine. The soft chime of a very old grandfather clock tucked away on the landing was the only reliable measure of time at the Atherton Club. And even that, Poirot reflected, seemed to tick with a certain deliberate, sleepy rhythm that actively discouraged haste. And the great detective had come to Atherton specifically for this discouragement, seeking a retreat from the crudities and violences of his recent cases, intending merely to nurse a delicate head cold and partake in the club's famed, if monotonous, evening routine. Yet even in this haven of predictable comfort, his highly organized mind found a single, minute point of irritation, a subtle flaw in the geometric perfection that the club prided itself upon. The Atherton, a sprawling Victorian mansion near Hampstead Heath, was less a traditional gentleman's club and more a discreet retirement home for the wealthy, the eccentric, and the very, very quiet, its walls lined with the patina of decades of polished wood and silence, its atmosphere thick with the comforting scent of leather, old books, and a faint, unmistakable aroma of expensive tobacco that lingered, ghost-like, from a bygone era. This evening, Poirot sat in the small library, designated as the quiet room, a place where even the turning of a page felt like an intrusion, nestled deeply into a wing-back chair upholstered in deep emerald velvet, the fire in the grate casting a warm, flickering pattern across the Persian rug. Outside, the London evening had settled into a gentle, persistent drizzle, which acted as a natural sound blanket, muffling the distant sounds of the city and enhancing the immediate feeling of insulation and safety. A perfect environment, one might think, for the little grey cells to finally go to sleep. But no, as he sipped his perfect cup of chocolate chord, prepared exactly at 5 minutes past 8 every night, his gaze kept returning to the mantelpiece above the fireplace, specifically to the arrangement of the 3 small decorative artifacts placed there. A bronze miniature of a Roman bust, a squat Ming vase of a particularly serene blue, and a small silver-backed travelling clock. And it was the placement of this clock that was causing the detective his professional unease. For last night, he was certain, as certain as one can be of a fact observed in a moment of utter relaxation, that the clock had been precisely centered between the bust and the vase, maintaining a perfect, soothing symmetry. But tonight it was perhaps a quarter of an inch, or even less, closer to the blue Ming vase, a difference so insignificant as to be utterly meaningless to any normal man. Yet to Hercule Poirot it was a profound declaration of disorder, a single, tiny, unnecessary question mark placed squarely in the middle of a perfectly declarative sentence. Chapter 2. The Residence of Atherton. The Atherton Club, as Poirot quickly deduced, was a delicate ecosystem of highly specified habits, each resident a creature of unbreakable routine, making the movement of the silver clock all the more curious. For who among this collection of predictable automatons would possess the carelessness or the audacity to tamper with the aesthetic arrangement of the quiet room's mantelpiece, a sacred space of visual balance? There was first Major Alistair Thorne, Thorne pronounced like the sharp growth, a retired military man whose movements were as stiff and predictable as a wind-up toy, always appearing in the library at 7:45 p.m. precisely to read the financial pages, his presence announced by the sharp, almost painful crispness of his starched collar. He was a man defined by the rigid vertical lines of his appearance and his behavior, and such a man would never introduce the asymmetry of a misplaced object. It was against his very nature. Then came Lady Beatrice Croft, a widow of great age and even greater fortune, who occupied the entire west wing and was famed for her absolute silence, communicating primarily through the highly articulate movements of her embroidered shawl, gliding through the halls with the solemnity of a galleon, never speaking a word, her only audible contribution to the club's atmosphere being the faint, sweet scent of lavender that preceded her and then vanished. She, too, was a monument to stillness, an unlikely perpetrator of frivolous rearrangement. The third permanent fixture was Mr. Silas Wren, Wren rhymes with pen, the club's curator and informal historian, a diminutive, pale gentleman whose eyes held the glazed, distant look of one who spends too much time cataloguing the past, his entire existence dedicated to the preservation and exact placement of every relic within the club's extensive, if dusty, collection. meaning any intentional alteration to a display by his hand was unthinkable, an act of professional self-sabotage, and the other guests were merely transient, forgettable entities who flitted in and out without leaving a trace, their brief, unremarkable lives causing no ripples in Atherton's placid waters, leaving Poirot with his three primary suspects, the major, the lady, and the curator, none of whom seemed to possess the motive, the inclination, or the necessary streak of capricious chaos to move a silver clock 1/4 of an inch to the left. Yet the clock had moved. That was the immutable fact, a silent challenge laid before the little grey cells, which, instead of resting, began to stir, slowly, lazily, like a cat stretching after a long, profound nap, demanding that this minute error in the universe be corrected, understood, and put to rights before the detective could truly find his peace and succumb to the soothing lure of sleep, the perfect routine of his evening completely disrupted by this small, almost impertinent detail. Chapter 3. The Missing Detail. The following morning, after a breakfast consisting of precisely 2 perfectly boiled eggs and a single piece of toast cut into 4 exact squares, Poirot's insistence on geometric precision extending even to his early morning nourishment, he returned to the quiet room, pretending to select a volume of French poetry from the shelf. But his true purpose was a careful, professional assessment of the crime scene, if such a grand term could be applied to the displacement of a clock. The clock remained closer to the Ming vase, but what truly caught his attention was not the clock itself, but the bronze bust of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which now appeared to have shifted slightly, its base no longer perfectly parallel to the mantel edge, but canted at a minute, barely perceptible angle, perhaps 1 degree off the true vertical, an adjustment so subtle it suggested not a careless grab, but a deliberate, almost surgical touch, hinting that the rearrangement was not the result of a cleaning rag or a clumsy elbow, but of a purposeful, if baffling, intervention. Poirot observed the 3 primary residents throughout the morning hours, their routines unfolding with their usual, almost comical precision. Major Thorne paced the sunroom exactly 4 times at 10:15 a.m., his steps measured and echoing on the parquet floor. Lady Croft sat at her writing desk in the salon, not writing, but simply holding a perfectly sharpened pencil over a sheet of vellum, a picture of stately inactivity. And Mr. Wren, the curator, moved through the corridors with a feather duster, lightly, almost reverently, addressing the dust on the portraits, but carefully avoiding the mantelpiece in the quiet room, a clear demarcation that this was not a cleaning matter, deepening the mystery of the slight, continuous alterations. Poirot realized that the crime was not the displacement of the clock, but the slow, creeping accumulation of disorder, a series of minute adjustments over time designed either to go unnoticed, or perhaps designed to be noticed only by a mind obsessed with order. a mind such as his own, and the sheer pettiness of the action suggested a private, internal motive entirely disconnected from financial gain or typical criminal malice, pointing instead toward a psychological or emotional underpinning, a silent message being left for a specific person or for the club itself. He settled into his chair, closing his eyes and pressing his fingertips together in his iconic posture of concentration. The movement so precise it was like the closing of a perfect tiny box, forcing his little grey cells to work, not on who moved the clock, but on why anyone would bother to move it at all. And it was then, in that moment of profound stillness, that he noticed the single, crucial, missing detail. A small, almost invisible film of dust on the Ming vase, but none on the silver travelling clock, suggesting that the clock, the object of his initial fascination, had been handled recently and with great care. A detail that suddenly made the motive behind the small, seemingly insignificant crime feel exponentially larger, more complex, and altogether more human. Chapter 4. The Quiet Interview with the Major. With the realization that the silver clock had been recently handled, Poirot decided to begin his gentle interrogation, selecting Major Thorn as his first subject, knowing the Major's rigid adherence to punctuality would ensure a brief, unflustered exchange that would still yield precise, factual details. He found the Major exactly where he predicted, in the conservatory, meticulously trimming a miniature bonsai tree, his large, calloused hands performing the delicate work with a surprising, almost unnatural precision. The contrast between the man's imposing military physique and his current, fussy occupation being a detail that immediately interested Poirot. The conversation began, of course, with the weather, a necessary opening gambit in any English inquiry. And then Poirot smoothly transitioned to the general state of the club, commenting on its admirable tranquility and the unflinching routine that governed its life. A deliberate flattery designed to lower the Major's guard and encourage his natural tendency toward detailed monologue. "A club of habit, Major," Poirot murmured, the emphasis on the word habit being subtle but intended to elicit a response about routine. And Major Thorn immediately took the bait, launching into a precise, almost tactical defense of the club's strictures, explaining that such routine was the only thing holding chaos at bay in the modern world, a strong statement from a man trimming a tree. Then Poirot moved in for the gentle strike, casually mentioning the quiet room's mantelpiece, sighing dramatically and adding, "It is a matter of aesthetics, Major, but I could have sworn the little silver clock was more centered yesterday. Perhaps my eyes play tricks on me." The Major stopped trimming instantly, his hand freezing mid-snip, and his reaction was immediate and highly agitated, not in the defensive manner of a guilty man, but in the irritated manner of a man whose own strict sense of order has been unexpectedly challenged by a shared observation. confirming that the Major was indeed a keen observer of the club's visual arrangements. "Nonsense, Poirot," the Major clipped out, his voice sharp and uncompromising. "I observed the clock precisely at 7:52 p.m. last night when I left the room, and it was perfectly aligned with the Roman bust. If it is moved now, it was moved after my departure. It is a monstrosity, this moving of objects. It unsettles the entire equilibrium of the evening." This was a fascinating answer, Poirot thought, as it proved two things. First, that the Major noticed the current state of disorder, and second, that he was so convinced of his own rigid observation that he provided a precise time frame, inadvertently giving Poirot an alibi and pointing suspicion elsewhere. But before Poirot could move on, the Major added a curious coda, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You know, Poirot, the clock used to sit exactly where the Ming vase is now. It was moved 10 years ago. It has never been happy in the center." This strange comment, attributing emotion to an inanimate object, suggested a deep, almost familial knowledge of the mantle's history, and a potential personal motive for wanting the clock to return to its original position, placing the Major back on the list of suspects, albeit for a motive rooted entirely in nostalgia and proprietary feeling for the club's furniture. An entirely harmless, yet entirely disruptive motive, only capable of creating a mystery of this subtle, quiet nature. Chapter 5. Lady Croft's Unspoken Language. The next suspect was Lady Croft, the silent matriarch of the Atherton, and engaging her in conversation required an entirely different, more tactful approach. For one cannot interrogate a silence, but one can certainly observe it. Poirot found her in the main lounge, sitting by the window, gazing out at the rain-swept garden, a picture of serene contemplation, and he approached her chair with a quiet, deferential bow, careful not to disturb the profound stillness that seemed to radiate from her presence. Instead of speaking, Poirot simply pulled up a nearby chair, remaining silent for several long, intentional minutes, allowing the shared quietude to settle over them like a comforting, heavy blanket, acknowledging that the lady's form of communication was not through spoken words, but through the nuanced language of presence and stillness, and he waited until she offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a signal that she acknowledged his company and was willing to permit his continuation. He began not by mentioning the clock, but by describing the feeling of the room, the profound sense of history that clung to the air, and the beauty of the Ming vase on the mantel, praising its particular shade of blue, which he described as the color of a dream, a technique designed to elicit an emotional rather than factual response. Lady Croft made no sound, but her hand, resting lightly on her embroidered shawl, moved a finger to trace a complex, almost hidden pattern in the silk, a pattern of 3 circles interlocking, followed by a sharp, straight line. a gesture Poirot immediately filed away as a possible non-verbal communication, a subtle way of organizing or processing the information he had just presented. He then moved to the gentle topic of change and memory, lamenting the modern world's obsession with novelty and its disregard for the cherished permanence of places like Atherton, mentioning the beauty of items that remain in the same place for decades. And at this, the lady finally offered a reaction that was undeniably clear. A single tear, large and perfectly formed, rolled slowly down her powdered cheek, yet her expression remained utterly composed, a mask of aristocratic sorrow that suggested a deep, profound connection to the concept of things staying fixed in time, things that shouldn't move. With great care, Poirot then mentioned the silver clock, noting its small recent shift, and the lady's reaction was immediate and startlingly physical. She quickly lifted her hand and covered the small, blurry photograph that sat beside her teacup, a photo showing a young man in a military uniform, a gesture that was the most eloquent denial of any involvement that a person could offer, equating the displacement of the clock with the protection of a profound, private memory. Poirot, realizing he had stumbled upon a far deeper and unnecessary private grief, immediately diverted the conversation back to the Ming vase and the comforting sound of the rain, silently apologizing to the lady's stillness for his intrusion, concluding that her motive for moving the clock was nil. She valued permanence, and her sole transgression was her exquisite, silent sorrow, leaving him with the enigmatic gesture of the three circles and the straight line, a puzzle belonging to a far older, sadder mystery than the case of the misplaced clock, and a conviction that the delicate silence of Lady Croft was entirely innocent of the small, irritating crime. Chapter 6. Mr. Wren and the Burden of History. Mr. Silas Wren, the club curator, was the next appointment, and Poirot found him in the dimly lit, labyrinthine basement archive, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of brittle documents and forgotten artifacts, the air thick with the dry, papery scent of antiquity, a smell that Wren seemed to wear like a second skin. The curator was meticulously cleaning a piece of old silver with a soft cloth, the object glinting faintly in the single, weak lamp that illuminated his workspace. And Poirot immediately recognized the piece as the silver-backed travelling clock from the mantel, confirming that Wren had handled the object, but for reasons entirely related to its preservation, not its displacement. Poirot opened the conversation by admiring Wren's dedication to the club's history, a subtle means of affirming the curator's proprietary obsession and encouraging him to reveal details about the object's past, details that might explain why it seemed so unhappy on the mantelpiece, as Major Thorn had suggested. Wren's response was a low, whispering torrent of dates and provenances, revealing that the clock was originally the property of the club's founder, Sir Eustace Atherton, and had been placed in the quiet room not as a timepiece, but as a symbolic object of quietude and consistency, always placed on the right side of the mantel, the position now occupied by the Ming vase, where it sat for nearly 50 years until it was moved 10 years prior to the center to make room for the newly acquired Ming vase, a gift from a wealthy benefactor. It was an outrage, Monsieur Poirot, Wren murmured, his voice laced with the long-held indignation of a purist whose sacred arrangement has been defiled. To move Sir Eustace's clock, the very symbol of Atherton's tradition, for a common piece of Chinese porcelain, no matter how valuable. I have never forgiven the committee for that aesthetic blunder. This deep-seated resentment was a clear, if petty, motive for wanting the clock to return to its original position, and Poirot felt a sudden surge of suspicion, wondering if Wren had been subtly nudging the clock back toward the right side, millimetre by millimetre, over the course of weeks, an act of silent, restorative vandalism only a true fanatic could sustain. Poirot then asked a direct question, his voice gentle but pointed. Mr. Wren, have you perhaps, out of respect for tradition, attempted to assist the clock on its return journey? Wren stopped polishing, his eyes wide and defensive, and he stammered out a denial, but his hands, unable to lie, began to compulsively wipe at the clock's perfect, dust-free surface, a gesture of guilty preoccupation. Yet the physical movement of his hands was telling. They were moving the polishing cloth in a fast, frantic, circular motion, wiping across the object, but not pushing it laterally. An observation that immediately cleared him of the act of moving the clock a quarter inch, but confirmed his deep, abiding desire for the rearrangement. Wren's guilt was one of intent, not of action, but as Poirot stood to leave, the curator confessed one last, small detail, an observation made by the little grey cell's rival. The Ming vase, Monsieur Poirot. It is not perfectly symmetrical. The blue pattern on the right side is thicker than the left. It has always bothered me. It creates an imbalance that the clock cannot correct. This final admission shifted Poirot's attention entirely, moving the focus from the clock, the victim, to the Ming vase, the usurper, an object whose own hidden imperfection might be the key to the entire subtle crime. Chapter 7. A Study in Symmetry. Returning to the quiet room, Poirot approached the mantelpiece not as a detective examining clues, but as a student of geometry and visual harmony, taking Mr. Wren's final comment to heart. And he examined the Ming vase closely, noting indeed that the intricate blue glaze on the right side, the side facing the window, possessed a slightly heavier, darker application than the left, an aesthetic imperfection that was invisible to the casual eye, but would be maddening to a mind like Mr. Wren's, or, indeed, to his own. He then looked at the two objects flanking the vase, the bronze bust on the left and the silver clock on the right, and realized the true nature of the visual crime. The vase's uneven weight created an optical illusion. making the area on its heavier side. The right appear too crowded, and anyone subconsciously trying to re-establish visual balance would instinctively push the object on the right, the silver clock, slightly further right to compensate for the vase's heavy-looking glaze, thus achieving a false sense of symmetry, which was the opposite of what had occurred, for the clock had moved left towards the heavy side of the vase. The little grey cells executed a swift mental deduction. The movement was not an attempt to create symmetry, but an attempt to access something on the far right side of the mantel, the small, dim space between the clock and the wooden panelling, a space that was previously too narrow to reach when the clock was perfectly centered. Poirot took a step back and placed his hands firmly on his hips, analyzing the trajectory of the movement, the small 1/4 inch shift to the left, and the slight canting of the Roman bust, and a completely new theory, divorced from Major Thorn's nostalgia and Mr. Wren's indignation, began to form. A theory centered entirely on the physicality of the space and the necessity of finding a hidden advantage. He moved the clock back to its original central position, creating a tight space between the clock and the wooden panelling, and then, slowly, he moved it to the position it currently occupied, the subtle shift to the left. And he realized that this minute alteration created just enough space for a small hand, a delicate hand perhaps, to slip behind the clock and access something that was previously hidden by the clock's width, something that could be tucked against the dark, carved wood of the wall. He ran his hand along the wall where the clock had shifted, feeling for any imperfection, any scratch, or any sign of a secret compartment, finding nothing but the smooth, aged surface of the panelling. Yet the feeling of certainty in his gut, that feeling that always preceded a correct solution, was now a loud, insistent voice demanding attention. And he then pressed his fingertips lightly against the panelling just behind where the clock had been, and felt a tiny, almost invisible indentation, no bigger than the head of a matchstick, that was clearly a microscopic thumb catch for a sliding panel, a detail that the casual or even the careful observer would miss entirely, confirming that the club's quiet history held a secret compartment, and the entire mystery of the misplaced clock was nothing more than a highly elaborate, patient mechanism for accessing a hidden space without attracting the suspicion of Major Thorn's rigid timing or Mr. Wren's historical piety. Chapter 8. The Message in the Wood. With the knowledge of the secret compartment, Poirot's investigation transformed from a passive observation of aesthetics to an active pursuit of information. And he decided to wait until the deepest hours of the night, when the Atherton Club truly slept, its routines having run their course and its residents surrendered to their dreams, before attempting to examine the hidden panel, ensuring that his own movements would not disrupt the profound, restorative silence that he himself had sought. Just past midnight, under the pale, unassuming light of the external security lamp filtering through the library window, he slipped back into the quiet room, moving with the preternatural stealth that only a man of absolute self-control can manage, his footsteps entirely absorbed by the thick Persian rug. And he approached the mantelpiece, the three artifacts looming like silent, knowing sentinels in the gloom. He carefully pushed the clock aside, placing it definitively in the center, before returning to the spot where he had felt the tiny indentation, and with a delicate pressure from the ball of his thumb, he depressed the small catch, and with a soft, almost sighing sound, a thin sliver of the dark wood panelling slid inward, revealing a compartment no bigger than a small snuff box, currently empty, but giving off the faint, distinctive scent of old paper and dried lavender, a scent that immediately caused Poirot's little grey cells to spring fully awake, linking this moment directly back to Lady Croft, the silent matriarch who communicated in lavender-scented silence. The compartment was empty, but the discovery was not in the contents, but in the nature of the mechanism used to open it. The panel's movement was stiff, requiring a slight, deliberate downward pressure on the wood just above it to ease the spring. And that downward pressure could only be achieved if a person were leaning heavily against the mantelpiece, a posture inconsistent with the Major's upright formality or Mr. Wren's delicate movements, but entirely consistent with the posture of a person who might be gazing out the window, resting their weight on the wood while waiting for something or someone, a posture that immediately brought to mind the profound stillness of Lady Croft sitting by the window in the main lounge, and the silent grief she had displayed when he mentioned permanence. The discovery of the compartment, coupled with the faint lavender scent, immediately shifted the focus from the act of moving the clock to the use of the clock's original position. And Poirot realized that the person who moved the clock was not accessing the compartment, but ensuring that no one else could access it easily. He ran his finger along the interior of the empty recess, finding one last detail that had been overlooked: a tiny, faint, pencil-thin scratch on the underside of the panel, not made by the mechanism, but by a rough or pointed object being repeatedly placed or retrieved from the compartment, suggesting that the space had been used frequently, perhaps over decades, to exchange small, secretive items, a thought that immediately linked the compartment's use to the lady's mysterious, silent sorrow, and the single tearful denial of any knowledge of the clock's movement, confirming her deep private knowledge of the club's oldest, most treasured secret. Chapter 9. The gentle conclusion. With the evidence collected, the scent of lavender, the hidden compartment, Lady Croft's reaction, Poirot did not rush to confront the lady, knowing that this was not a matter for Scotland Yard or for grand theatrics, but a private matter requiring delicate, gentle resolution, a process more akin to quiet therapy than aggressive interrogation. And he arranged for a private chat the following afternoon in a small, unused sitting room, requesting only that she bring her embroidered shawl, the one with the hidden pattern. He began the conversation by placing a piece of paper in front of her, on which he had drawn the 3 interlocking circles and the sharp, straight line she had traced with her finger the day before, and he spoke softly, avoiding judgment, asking, "Madam, what is the meaning of this pattern? It seems to be the one true secret of the Atherton Club." Lady Croft, though visibly startled, did not deny the pattern, and after a moment of profound, agonizing silence, she finally spoke, her voice a fragile, papery sound, unused and weak from decades of silence. "It is a code, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered. "A game played by 3 friends, my husband, the Major, and myself, when we were all very young and came here as students before the war. The 3 circles represented truth, beauty, and order. The 3 great concepts of life. The straight line was the secret path to obtaining them. She explained that the hidden compartment was their original letterbox, used to exchange small private notes, secrets, and declarations of love during a time when their courtship was forbidden by her strict family. And the silver clock was there, agreed upon signal. When the clock was moved to the right side, its original spot, it meant the box was open and safe to check. When it was placed in the center, it meant danger and to avoid the room, an archaic, charming code of youth that had survived into their old age, the Major, the lady, and her now deceased husband being the only 3 who knew the mechanism. But why, Poirot then asked, was the clock moved slightly to the left now, out of the safety zone and into a confusing new position? Lady Croft's composure finally broke, and she confessed, her eyes wet with tears. "The Major, God bless him, he is failing. He forgets things. Last week, he thought the center position meant open and was struggling to open the panel, almost breaking the delicate mechanism. I had to subtly move the clock a quarter of an inch to the left, towards the window, to make it impossible for his large fingers to find the catch, hoping to protect the club's secret and his own dignity from his forgetfulness. The small movement was a gesture of profound loyalty and protection, a signal not for communication, but for cessation, a quiet declaration that the game was now truly and forever over. Poirot nodded, understanding the beautiful, painful simplicity of the motive, realizing that the crime was not against order, but an act of deep, protective affection, a small, necessary transgression against aesthetic perfection made in defense of a great friendship. And he quietly assured her that the mechanism was safe, the secret still protected, and the little grey cells were now entirely satisfied, having restored not just the balance of the mantelpiece, but the dignity of a gentle, aging friend, allowing the weight of the mystery to lift from the atmosphere like a soft, comforting sigh. Chapter 10. Tucking in the little grey cells, with the truth established and the gentle matter concluded, Poirot retired to his rooms, feeling an enormous, satisfying sense of finality and peace, the kind of deep contentment that only comes from solving a puzzle, even one so small and so human as the case of the perpetual twilight. He sat for a final moment in the soft glow of his bedside lamp, its light muffled by the thick, sound-absorbing curtains, allowing the soothing weight of the evening's events to settle over his mind, contemplating the delicate balance between the truth of the heart and the facts of the case, realizing that some mysteries are best solved not with logic and geometry, but with empathy and a profound respect for the quiet, enduring loyalties between friends. The little grey cells, having performed their duty with their customary elegance and precision, now began their final, glorious act of the night, the process of unwinding, each cell releasing its tension, its concerns, its calculations, like tiny ships dropping anchor in a deep, sheltered harbour. He took a long, slow sip of a glass of warm milk, its soothing temperature and sweet simplicity providing the final counterpoint to the complexity of the evening, and his gaze drifted over the perfectly arranged objects on his own bedside table, his watch, his spectacles, and a small, cherished silver icon, each object placed in its precise, correct spot, forming a visual declaration of order that was now utterly unassailable. Outside, the London night continued its gentle drizzle, the sound against the window pane a rhythmic, hypnotic shush, creating a perfect white noise that sealed the room in a bubble of safety and warmth. And the great detective felt the last vestiges of his professional alertness melt away, his breathing deepening and slowing, his meticulously organized mind finally admitting defeat to the irresistible lure of deep, quiet rest. And you, my dear listener, should now follow his example, letting the feeling of this profound order and peace wash over you, knowing that the mystery has been solved, the atmosphere is safe, and the little grey cells of your own mind are being tucked in, safe and sound, for a night of deep, restorative slumber. The mahogany walls of the Atherton Club hold their secrets, the silver clock is safe, and the only remaining task is to surrender entirely to the pull of the sheets and the gentle final darkness. Sleep now. Sleep well.